My father passed away 6 months ago, and I don't think I've fully processed it yet. The grief still hits me at random times, when I hear a song he used to hum, when I pass by a store we used to visit together, or when I sit down to pay my bills and remember that he was the one who taught me how to budget. He was a hardworking, self-made man, the kind who never took shortcuts and believed in earning everything you had. He had always been upfront with my brother, 30M, and me, 27F, about his plans for his estate. He wanted us to have what he had worked so hard for: his savings, his house, his investments. He even discussed the will with us before he passed. "You two are my kids. Everything I have is for you." It wasn't about favoritism. It was about who he raised. Then there's my stepmother, 48F, and her 3 kids, 22M, 19F, and 17M. My father married her about 10 years ago, long after my parents' divorce. My brother and I were already adults by then, so there was never a real blending of families. My stepmother's kids had their own dad, who was still in their lives, and my father was never a father figure to them. He tried to be kind, he helped them financially when he could, but there was no deep connection. They rarely visited him unless they needed something. And yet, after he passed, suddenly we were all supposed to be one big, grieving family. At first, I thought it was just awkward politeness. My stepmother started acting overly sweet, calling my brother and me her wonderful stepkids, which was hilarious considering she barely acknowledged us when my father was alive. Then, a few weeks after the funeral, she brought us all together for a family talk. That's when she dropped the bombshell. "So, I know your dad's will was written a while ago, before he truly got to bond with my kids." She smiled like this was just a casual conversation, like she was asking me to pass the salt. "I think if he were still here, he'd want you to share with them. It's only fair." I just sat there, staring at her, trying to process what she had just said. Fair? What exactly was fair about giving away the inheritance that my father had intentionally left for his own children? I glanced at my brother, expecting him to say something first, but he was just as stunned as I was. My stepmother, however, looked completely at ease, like she genuinely believed this was a reasonable request. "You know," she continued, her voice light and casual, "they saw him as a father figure too. It would mean so much to them if you did the right thing here." I almost laughed. A father figure? They barely even acknowledged him when he was alive. They never called him dad, never spent holidays with him unless their mother forced them to, and when he was sick in the hospital, not one of them showed up to visit. But now that there was money involved, suddenly, he was their beloved second father? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check, and calmly said, "No. Dad left his will exactly as he wanted it. We're not changing that." The room went dead silent. Her expression twisted slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. The fake sweetness in her tone disappeared. "So you're just going to hoard all that money while my kids struggle?" Struggle? What struggle? Her kids had another father, one who was still alive and capable of providing for them. Meanwhile, my brother and I had just lost the only parent we had left. My father didn't owe them anything. He wasn't responsible for them. He would have wanted this, she insisted. He just didn't have time to update the will. I clenched my fists under the table. No, he wouldn't have. He knew exactly what he was doing. That's when her oldest son, 22M, chimed in, arms crossed, leaning back in his chair like this whole thing was an inconvenience to him. Wow, I guess money really changes people. I turned to him, barely able to hold back my frustration. Money changes people? That was rich coming from someone who had barely acknowledged my father when he was alive. Where was this father-son devotion when my dad was sitting alone in a hospital room, hooked up to machines? Where was this love when he needed help moving furniture because chemo had made him too weak? Where was this concern when he was going through the hardest battle of his life? It wasn't there. But now? Now that there was an inheritance, suddenly my father was family to them. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but my patience was wearing thin. He wasn't your dad. He was mine and brother's. You have your own father, so why are you acting like you're entitled to ours? My stepmother's face darkened. Her voice sharpened. Because we're a family. I let out a bitter laugh. No, we're not. You made that very clear when he was alive. Her younger kids looked down, shifting uncomfortably. They weren't even arguing because they knew the truth too. They knew they had never treated my father as family, and now they were sitting in front of me, waiting for a payout. When it became clear we weren't giving in, my stepmother went into full victim mode. Your father would be ashamed of you, she spat. You're being selfish. Greedy. You have more than enough. You're just choosing to let my children struggle. The worst part? She actually started crying. Like full-on tears, wiping at her face dramatically, like she was the one being wronged. I almost felt bad for a second, almost. But then I remembered the way she barely acknowledged my dad's existence when he was here. The way she never spoke about him with love, only obligation. Then came the text messages. My stepmother went to extended family, telling them my brother and I were hoarding our father's estate while her poor kids were left with nothing. Suddenly, I had aunts and cousins blowing up my phone, telling me, you don't need all that money. Just give them something, it's the right thing to do. One cousin actually had the audacity to say, it's not about the money. It's about honoring your father's memory. No. Honoring my father's memory means respecting his wishes. Honoring my father's memory means not letting people who barely acknowledged him take advantage of his death. So, ATA for refusing to share my inheritance with my step-siblings? TA for refusing to let my ex name our baby after his new girlfriend? I never thought I'd be in a situation like this. I'm 27F, currently 7 months pregnant with my ex's 29M baby. Let's call him Jake. We were together for about 4 years, and for most of that time, I truly believed he was the one. We talked about marriage, kids, the future. We had plans. We even picked out baby names, used to joke about whether our kids would inherit his curly hair or my freckles, and he would always say, our kids are going to be the luckiest in the world. I thought we were building something solid, something real. Then, about a year ago, I found out he was cheating on me. Not a one-time thing, not some drunken mistake, a full-blown, months-long affair with someone from his gym. I still remember the exact moment I found out. I was doing laundry when I noticed a receipt in his jeans pocket, a fancy dinner for 2 at a restaurant I'd never even heard of, on a night he had told me he was working late. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a work dinner? Maybe he went with a friend? But deep down, I already knew. The doubt ate at me until I finally gave in and checked his phone while he was asleep. And there it was. Hundreds of messages. Messages that made it painfully clear that this wasn't just some fling, it was a relationship. I read through weeks of texts, inside jokes, pet names, messages like, I love waking up next to you, and I hate that I have to pretend I don't know you in public. That one hit me the hardest. He wasn't just cheating, he was living a whole other life behind my back. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he hit me with the classic, I wasn't happy anymore, but I didn't know how to tell you. As if that excused lying, sneaking around, and making me feel like an idiot. I packed my things that night and left. The breakup was messy, he wanted to stay friends, and I wanted to set his car on fire. But I didn't. I just cut ties and tried to move on. Then, about a month later, I took a pregnancy test. Positive. By that point, Jake had already publicly moved on with the woman he cheated with. Let's call her Emma, 26F. Their relationship was plastered all over social media, cutesy date photos, matching gym outfits, even a couple's retreat, vacation that he took her on 2 weeks after we broke up. Meanwhile, I was sitting alone in my apartment, staring at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test, feeling like the universe had just played the cruelest joke on me. At first, Jake tried to weasel his way out of responsibility, saying things like, are you sure it's mine? And maybe we should talk about other options. That one hurt the most. He had spent years talking about wanting kids, and now that I was pregnant with his, he was acting like it was a burden. But when the reality set in, he decided he wanted to be involved. I wasn't going to stop him. I'm not the type to keep a child from their father, no matter how much I hate him. We agreed on co-parenting, and for the most part, things have been civil. Until now. Because yesterday, Jake told me he wants to name our baby after his new girlfriend. At first, I thought he was joking. I actually let out a small laugh, waiting for him to smirk or tell me he was messing with me. But he just sat there, completely serious, like this was a totally normal conversation to be having. "You're not serious," I said, my voice already tightening. "Why wouldn't I be?" he replied, leaning back on my couch like he hadn't just said the most insane thing ever. "Emma is a huge part of my life now, and she'll be in our baby's life too. I think it would be nice to honor that." I stared at him, speechless. My mind was scrambling to find the logic, any possible reason why he would think this was even remotely acceptable. I had to remind myself to breathe before I could even respond. "Jake, you want to name our child after the woman you cheated on me with?" His expression twitched like he hadn't expected me to say it that bluntly. "Come on, don't make it sound like that. The past is the past. Emma and I are serious, and she's going to be in the baby's life anyway, so why not? It's just a name." Just a name? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The sheer audacity of this man. He betrayed me, lied to me, humiliated me, and now he wanted me to name our child, our baby, after the person who was the reason we were no longer together? Was he insane? I felt something hot and ugly boil up inside me, but I kept my voice as steady as I could. Absolutely not. That's never going to happen. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, I saw the flash of annoyance in his expression. "You're being unreasonable. It's not like I'm asking to name the baby something crazy. It's a normal name. A beautiful one, actually." I was so angry I almost laughed. "Jake, I don't care if it's the most beautiful name in the world. You could be asking me to name this baby after a literal saint, and I'd still say no. You don't get to honor your affair partner by branding her name onto my child." That's when his entitlement switched gears. "So what, you just get full control over the name? That's not fair. I'm the father, I should have a say too." I crossed my arms. "You do get a say. You get to suggest names that aren't the name of the woman you destroyed our relationship for." He sighed dramatically, rubbing his hands over his face like I was the one being difficult. "Look, I know you still have feelings about what happened, but you need to move on. This isn't about you and me anymore. It's about the baby. And Emma is going to be part of our kid's life no matter what. Naming her after Emma is just a way to show that we're all one family now." I nearly screamed. "We are not one family. And my child is not going to be a tribute to your girlfriend." That's when he got pissy. He rolled his eyes and muttered, "I knew you were going to be like this. You're so bitter, it's pathetic." I stood up, not even caring that I was shaking with anger. "Get out of my house, Jake. Are you serious? Over a name? Over everything. Get out." He muttered something under his breath but finally stood up. As he reached the door, he turned and gave me this condescending smirk. "You're going to regret this. Emma is going to be an amazing stepmom, whether you like it or not." Then he left. I sat down on the couch, feeling like I had just run a marathon. My whole body was tense, my hands still shaking with rage. The nerve of that man. The absolute entitlement. Later, I got a text from Jake's sister, who has always been on my side, saying, "Jake told Mom you won't let him name the baby and that you're being petty." Don't worry, I shut that down fast. But just a heads up, he's already playing the victim. And sure enough, within hours, I started getting messages from his family. His mom, his cousins, even his aunt. "Why are you making this so difficult? Jake has just as much right to name the baby as you do. Emma is going to be a stepmom. What's the big deal?" The big deal? The big deal? I am 7 months pregnant, carrying a child he didn't even want at first, and now he wants to name her after the woman he cheated on me with? So, ATA for refusing? Or are these people all completely delusional? Story 3. AITA for not letting my dad bring his mistress to my wedding? I always knew my dad wasn't husband material. He and my mom were married for nearly 25 years, but I can't remember a time when they were actually happy together. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was always passive-aggressive jabs or full-on shouting matches. The only reason they stayed together for so long was because of me and my siblings. We always knew the day would come when they'd finally call it quits, and sure enough, about 4 years ago, my mom found out my dad was cheating. Not just a one-time thing. Not even just one affair. Multiple. Over the years, my dad had been sneaking around with different women, lying to my mom's face, pretending to be the loyal husband and father while carrying on like he was some kind of bachelor. My mom was devastated. She had given up her career to raise us, stood by him through his struggles, always put our family first, and this was how he repaid her. They divorced immediately, and my mom was left to start over at nearly 50. My dad, on the other hand? He moved in with his mistress within 3 months. Not even the most recent one of the women he had been cheating with for years. Let's call her Lisa, 45F. Apparently, their love was real and meant to be, even though she was fully aware he was married when she got involved with him. The whole thing made me sick. I try to stay civil with my dad for the sake of peace, but my relationship with him has never been the same. He expected me to accept Lisa with open arms, constantly pushing her into my life, inviting her to family events like she hadn't been part of the reason my family fell apart. He'd say things like, "I know it was messy, but sometimes things just happen." As if his years of lying and betrayal were some kind of romantic, fate-driven love story instead of pure selfishness. Fast forward to now, I'm getting married in 3 months. My fiancé, 30M, and I are beyond excited, and we're keeping our guest list small and intimate, only close family and friends. When I gave my dad his invitation, I made one thing very clear. Lisa is not invited. The moment I said Lisa wasn't invited, I could see the shift in my dad's expression. His eyebrows twitched, his mouth pulled into a tight line, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, trying to process what he had just heard. For a brief second, I thought he might actually accept it, but then the disappointment set in. His jaw clenched, and that familiar look of entitlement crossed his face, the same look I had seen so many times when he didn't get his way. At first, he tried to rationalize it, as if I had simply made an error in judgment. He talked about how Lisa had been in his life for years now, how she was his partner, how it made no sense to exclude someone so important to him. His voice carried that condescending tone he always used when he thought he was the reasonable adult in the room, and I was just being overly emotional. But the more he spoke, the more I realized this wasn't about Lisa at all. This was about control. My dad had always been the kind of man who assumed people would eventually bend to his will. He had spent years manipulating my mom into accepting his lies, making her doubt her own instincts while he snuck around behind her back. He had played the role of the perfect family man in public, only to turn around and live a completely different life in private. And now, even after the truth had come out, he still thought he could dictate how things should be. He couldn't understand why I wasn't just letting it go. To him, it was just the past, something inconvenient but no longer relevant. He had moved on, so why was I still holding on to it? But what he refused to see was that my wedding wasn't just another family gathering. It wasn't a holiday dinner where people could be forced to play nice for a few hours. It was one of the most important days of my life, and the idea of my mom having to sit there, watching her ex-husband parade around with the woman who had helped destroy their marriage, made me sick. The moment he realized I wasn't backing down, his disappointment turned into anger. His posture stiffened, his voice lost its careful, rational tone, and the accusations started. I was being unfair. I was being immature. I was letting my mom manipulate me. He painted himself as the victim, as if I was punishing him for something that had nothing to do with me. He even tried to guilt-trip me, telling me I was forcing him to choose between his relationship and his daughter, that I was putting him in an impossible position. But the truth was, I wasn't putting him in any position at all. He had a choice. He could come to my wedding alone, or he could choose to stay home. That was entirely up to him. I wasn't the one making demands. I was setting a boundary. A boundary that, deep down, I think he knew he couldn't argue against. Eventually, when it became clear that I wasn't changing my mind, he resorted to his final tactic, dismissiveness. He gave me that smug, knowing look, the one he had used so many times when I was a kid, as if he was amused by my stubbornness. He told me I'd change my mind. That, as the wedding got closer, I'd realize how ridiculous I was being and that I wouldn't actually want my father to miss such an important moment. He made it sound like I was a child throwing a tantrum, convinced that I'd come to my senses when the dust settled. But he was wrong. A few hours after he left, the calls started. His side of the family, cousins, aunts, even a few distant relatives who barely knew the situation, all had something to say. They told me I was tearing the family apart, that I was holding onto the past, that weddings are about family, not grudges. I saw the same talking points repeated over and over, as if he had personally given them a script. It was exhausting, and part of me wanted to block every single one of them. Then came the text from Lisa. It was long, overly polite, and completely insincere. She said she was so sorry for the misunderstanding and that she really hoped we could put the past behind us. She wrote about how she knew things had been complicated, but that she was excited to be part of my dad's life and, by extension, mine too. The entire message was dripping with fake humility, like she was the mature one extending an olive branch while I was the unreasonable child refusing to accept it. I didn't respond. I didn't owe her a response. My dad, on the other hand, hasn't spoken to me in over a week. I know he's waiting for me to fold, waiting for me to call him and tell him I've changed my mind. But I haven't. I won't. Because I meant what I said. Lisa is not coming to my wedding. So, ATA for refusing to let my dad bring his mistress? Or am I just the only one who remembers what she actually is?